What's up, everybody? This is Willie, and today is the review on the recently concluded 38th Amazing Race season, which was the European adventures pertaining to all Big Brother players who would be racing with their loved ones. And the concept itself was very fascinating to see every team consisting of a player from Big Brother who would be competing alongside one of their partners. Though with that said, the season itself ended up being middle of the road for me because it just felt like there were clear-cut candidates on who would dominate these competitions, and this season feel like it was just lacking a huge significant moment or any of substance to make a name for itself. Like, despite all the hype coming into this season, this just ended up being a regression from Amazing Race 37, which I think that season's way better than this. And to make a better emphasis, let's talk about the route itself, where this season is themed around a European adventure, which means all the legs outside of the finale takes place around Europe, which nothing against Europe, it's aesthetically pleasing. In some of these locations is a good tourist attraction. However, it does make the legs aesthetically feel a bit too samey, and also I think the problem here is that it really limits a lot of the travel, where pretty much only centering around one continent just mitigates a lot of the traveling that would actually give a more diverse sort of mold. And instead we're just basically watering down our route once again, following a similar shtick like the COVID seasons, which what are we doing, man? Well, with that said, at least we know it's not permanent, as the following season, without going down into too much spoilers, even though I'm not even as spoiled on the season itself, yes, it has a wider route than 38, which was more limited. But yeah, I think the choice of it only being a European adventure was not the most ideal in the world, and feels like once again they just regressed from what potential renaissance they had with the last couple seasons that did not involve any sort of constraints. So that's everything I gotta say, and now let's just get to the review of the season. Episode 1, it was fine. You know, it was a pretty interesting way the players were introduced to the theme of the season with all Big Brother players. And so they land in Netherlands, and they do the first test where there is something for the first and last team, where the last team is issued a hazard that they must do during the leg, while the first team gets an express pass, which Kyla and Taylor happen to be that team. And on top of that, on getting first, they also get a second express pass that they get to hand over to another team, and they choose Jazz and Jag. So anyways, Enzo and Jack end up being the team in last and are given the hazard. And throughout the leg, which was just pretty baseline, outside of maybe some drama with a couple teams in the bottom of the packs, with someone like Matt and Megan and Kat and Alex, with the latter making a small little mistake. But despite all of that, Enzo and Jack just couldn't keep up with the team, and with that hazard twist seeming to really deteriorate their pacing, they ended up coming in last and being the first boots of the season. Episode 2, which was a much more decent episode with some fun drama at the beginning, where teams had to take a train to the Czech Republic, and because certain teams by placement are not going to be able to get on the same train as everyone else ahead of them, their traveling is going to be all over the place, and we see that be the case. And even the teams near the top would actually get off the wrong stop too, which was humorous. But hey, for the teams on the bottom, it was also not great for them as well, as one of their trains essentially got cancelled, so there had to be some impromptu in the process. But you know what, that gave us a little fun reunion with Matt and Megan, who were in the bottom of the pack, were essentially traveling solo until they met up with them on the impromptu route. But anyways, now we get to the leg, and it ended up being more of the same with the last leg. Not really much interesting going on, outside of a humorous mistake where Tucker and Eric accidentally skipped a detour and make it to the pit stop only to be rejected check-in by Phil, which hey, that's better than getting penalized. And finally, despite this big mistake, which could have taken a lot of time, they still ended up checking in the same placement that they initially would have, on top of, I guess, being cocky by buying some ice cream in the process too. Anyways, the bottom teams come down to Angela, Lexi, and Matt and Megan, and although I really didn't want to lose the former, it ended up being the inevitable here with Matt and Megan being able to make up some grounds, and unfortunately that meant Angela and Lexi checked in last and have been eliminated, which just sucks to lose a figure like her so early. Episode 3, which felt pretty mid, as it was such a foregone conclusion Matt and Megan were gonna go home. But hey, I should also talk about that this is where we got the driver's seat again, which Natalie and Stephanie ended up being the one to do it, as well as the fact that they are in a 3-person alliance with Jazz and Jack and Joseph and Adam. However, this driver's seat ended up being a bit underwhelming and rudimentary compared to last season's, and with the legs design not really having too much gravity to it, outside of maybe Jack and Jazz willing to let Natalie and Stephanie take first place, which I mean, good on them, because having 3 wins in a row kind of actively puts a target on your back. But anyways, like I said, Matt and Megan were definitely goners at this point, and even when they reached the roadblock, everyone had already checked in, and we get another situation where Phil has to wait at the task to eliminate them, kind of cementing how disastrous of a team they were on this season. Episode 4, where teams finally leave the Czech Republic and make their way to Hungary, and there we also have the fast forward in play, which just ends up being a Rubik's Cube challenge that Tucker and Eric end up partaking in, and they were successful unsurprisingly, so this ended up being the start of their streak of first place wins. But anyways, for Jag and Jazz, this is probably the only leg that they face some level of adversity as they struggle to get a taxi, which kind of stems from very icky circumstances, which I don't know why that's the case, but anyways, the leg plays out as standard as possible, with the final detour being seemingly the decider on which team is going to struggle the most, which is Kat and Alex end up falling fate to that, and despite not leaving the roadblock last, they ended up leaving their detour last, and they are the ones to go home from this leg. Now we get to episode 5, where they go to Croatia, and we finally get the return of the U-turn board, with Jack and Jess and Joseph and Adam being able to issue them to teams like Izzy and Paige and Rabina and Christine, which does lead to some outrage from Izzy and Paige and seeking revenge on Jazz and Jag, which, to let you know from spoiler, they weren't successful, which is just a bummer because I would have loved for the show to indulge more on this rivalry between the two teams, but that ended up being shallow in the end. But what's not shallow is a narrative that ends up getting set up for something down the road when Kyla and Taylor complain about male domination after seeing the U-turn results, which as they arrive in the roadblock, Tucker and Eric unexpectedly overheard their conversation and now alerted Jag and Jez about it too, so that ended up putting a rift in their relationship with Kyla and Taylor despite them giving the express pass. But anyways, despite the U-turn team suffering that fate, they're able to make up some time, and with some struggles on the last part of the roadblock, which ends up being a little race that you have to pass the finish line in a certain time, Simone just couldn't be able to do that, and that would end up costing her and Hannah's team the race as they would end up in last and getting eliminated. Episode 6, which is another by the numbers, as not much was really interesting going on in the leg. Well, maybe outside of the roadblock, which had an interesting touch to where the questions aren't fixed and that they would be randomized as teams are ready to answer them. But I feel like that touch itself didn't really have too much of an effect as teams just started picking up on it. But anyways, this is the start of where potential non-elimination leg will be in play, as Phil would display the phrase that a team may be eliminated, indicating that there is a non-elimination in play soon. But for this leg in particular, no, it's still an elimination leg. And unfortunately for Rabina and Christine, they ended up falling victim to last, which I guess the U-turn that they got last leg had greatly impacted the run that caused them to fall in the back of the pack and get eliminated this round. Episode 7, which I guess was a bit better as we had a really shocking downfall for a strong team. But anyways, they now travel to Romania, where we start off with a skydive, but also some team interactions where it's not race related. And so as the leg plays out, we have this grueling downfall for Natalie and Stephanie, who just constantly made mistakes after mistakes with some parking issues and their struggles at almost everything with the tasks they do. But anyway, for the teams on top, this is Tucker and Eric's 4th leg win in a row, which is just insane. And it goes to show how unstoppable Tucker really is, which luckily for the players on BU26, they got him out when the opportunity was open. But here on the race, it felt like they were just poised to dominate the race, which all would the tables have turned in a couple legs later. But anyways, there at least is some humor with Phil running away from Joseph and Adam when they try to hug him at the pit stop, which how could you break character? But anyways, Natalie and Stephen, like I said, had this crazy downfall and it ended up fulfilling that with their unexpected elimination in this leg. Jumping forward to episode 8, and that episode literally meant nothing because it was a non-elimination round, finally the one that audience was anticipating for. But either way, the leg plays out in pretty much its regular fashion, but we did at least get some drama from someone like Chelsea and Jack, where it seemed like they were going to get last place, but they ultimately scraped on by just in time, as Joseph and Adam struggled hard on the first task, which involved Easter eggs. Meanwhile, this is also the end of the story for the Express Pass users in Jazz and Jag and Kyla and Taylor as they end up using theirs. And hey, that went well for the former as they finally ended Tucker and Eric's streaks of first place wins. But needless to say, there wasn't much amounting to this episode, with Joseph and Adam coming in last and only being saved by a non-elimination twist. Episode 9, where we have the teams now go to Greece, and first thing they do, they meet on Phil at the beginning because of a U-turn boat, which yes, finally another situation to give agency to the players. And also for Joseph and Adam's punishment for coming in last, they automatically get a vote casted against them. But that didn't amount to much because clearly there was a definitive option on who was getting U-turned in Tucker and Eric. However, for the second team, it ended up being a tie between Jag and Jazz and Taylor and Kylan, and this is where the storyline from episode 5 finally comes into effect, as because Jag and Jazz learned of Kylan and Taylor's comments against the male domination, they decided to vote for them, much to their own dismay, despite the fact that they would end up casting one of their throwaway votes to Izzy and Paige, which that does come off a bit hypocritical on Taylor and Kylan's part. But anyway, now a revote commenced, and if there was a tie again, then they both get U-turned, and yep, it got tied again, so we have 3 teams U-turned now, and so the leg begins, and despite the stronger teams being U-turned, they're still somehow being able to stay consistent with their lead, because I guess everyone else is just so sucky at this race that they can't even beat a very strong team that had been U-turned. And it looked like, oh, it's game over. Tucker and Eric were clearly going to dominate no matter what. But this leg would ultimately become the biggest downfall that would never have been anticipating at all. And that all stems from the final roadblock that involves Greek alphabet. And Tucker heavily struggled on this most, which allowed every teams behind him to bypass him and shockingly put his team in last, which they would end up getting eliminated in this spot, which, wow, what a crazy turn of events that was, where it's not even the U-turn vote directly that costed them the race. It ends up being the roadblock itself, which, to be fair, the U-turn did still have some effect on them, as we know they were neck and neck with Kylan and Taylor, and if they had made it there earlier, they would have definitely been able to beat them out. So I'm definitely not nullifying the effects of the U-turn vote in this spot, but it seems like Tucker and Fair got very unlucky with the task that ended up making them struggle the most at. Episode 10, which is an episode I did not even care about, but alright, now they go to Italy, and we start off with a roadblock with the most notable thing coming from Adam, who, I did not talk about this yet, but Adam suffers from type 1 diabetes, so there was cases where it made his navigation around the race pretty tough, and I do sympathize with him for that. But I feel like it really got to its peak with this roadblock, where it really took a toll on his body for the worse, which gracefully, the judges made some great accommodations for him so that he'll be able to work around his situation. But anyways, Jack ends up struggling the most at the roadblock, despite the fact that he was ahead of the team of Kylan and Taylor, who ended up having to travel to Italy separately from the group. But despite the lost time, they were able to leapfrog them in this roadblock, which Jack and Chelsea would not be able to catch up by the end of it, and they would end up coming in last and getting eliminated, just simply like that. Then we get episode 11, which might as well be the epitome of this middling energy, as while the teams race their leg in France, there really isn't much going for it outside of maybe a scramble that didn't feel as impactful by the end of it. And guess what? Just like Amazing 337 in the penultimate episode, they decided to do another cliffhanger when it came down to either Joseph and Adam and Izzy and Paige. Again, why are you pulling these crappy endings? And for the episode, I mean, the only interesting that I can think of talking about is the Braille roadblock, as I was actually interested in the concept itself when I've been seeing it often in places, so thanks for teaching me that. But also, I just love when the judges decide to just get up and get coffee after they were bored waiting for at least one of the teams to get a check. But that's pretty much all I can say from this episode. And finally, episode 12, the finale, which was boring. But anyways, let's follow up with what happened at the cliffhanger, where it ended up being Joseph and Adam checking in third place, being Izzy and Paige are last and have been eliminated. So anyways, now the final three in Jag and Jazz, Taylor and Kylan, and Joseph and Adam travel back to the US in New York City to race the final leg, and unsurprisingly, Jag and Jess just continue maintaining their lead as always. Although they did have a misstep at a point with the fabric being twisted around their wheel, they still ended up staying consistent with their run, and I think the only notable thing that I can think of is the Sesame Street task. Like, don't get me wrong, I liked Sesame Street as a kid, and seeing Cookie Monster and Oscar was surreal to see on a reality show I watched, but it feels very indifferent to the capacity of Amazing Race seasons back in the day. So anyways, there was no way in heck Joseph and Adam and Kylan and Taylor were catching up to them, especially Joseph and Adam, who just faced a taxi issue because their driver wouldn't wait for them, and Kylan and Taylor were just not quick enough to catch up to Jag and Jazz, despite being good at the supposed crossword puzzle at the final task, which Jag and Jazz happened to finish first and made their way to the Yankee Stadium, where they step on the final pit stop and are declared the winners of the season. So congratulations to those two. But anyways, Taylor and Kylan come in second and Joseph and Adam come in third, and that is the end of the finale for you, which again was not the most riveting in the world and pretty much concludes the whole mid feeling with this season. So that ends off my review on the season, and you know what? For some interest, I'm just going to give each team a quick eulogy on my thoughts on them in boot order. So start off with Enzo and Jack. I mean, they went home first. Not much really go off of on the run, especially since they were pretty much set up for a quick downfall blended with the hazard they were issued. And to be honest, there's points I forgot they were even on this season as well. Angela Lexi, like I said, was a pretty big bummer to lose them this early, because likewise, Angela was such a chaotic figure in BB26. So it was great to see her back on reality TV, especially with her dynamic with her daughter, and I wish she got more of it because there was more potential of some fun chaotic energy between the two, but it just was pretty short-lived because they did not have much of a long run in them. Matt and Megan, they ended up being such a disaster from the start and pretty much wasn't poised to make it that far. And even in the final leg, it kind of epitomizes how disastrous of a team they are, and even getting eliminated not even at the pit stop. So yeah, and as a dynamic on the show, I'll be honest, I personally didn't find them to be the most notable in the world, so yeah. Next, Kat and Alex, and they were fine. Obviously not a team that was really that strong, and we definitely saw they were prone to mistakes after that first leg that really deteriorated their placement. But outside of that, the only thing I'm going to point out in the funny little stat is that Kat is never going to be able to escape placing 10th because, hey, she got that placement in BB21 too, so she's definitely cursed with that placement. Next, we have Hannah and Simone, and they were fine too. I mean, I do like Hannah from BB23, so she was a part of another team that was rootable for me. And they were more average racers, but after the previous leg where they were in last place at some point, I knew they were not prone for that long, and yeah, it ended up being the case where they would end up going home in this leg. But still, a fine enough dynamic on the show, and they kind of sucked when they went out that early. Next up, Rabina and Christine, and okay, I might be one of the only people who actually was interested in seeing Rabina back. Not that I think she's good TV, because looking at BB26, she wasn't the most riveting personality. However, I think her dynamic with her sister did at least have some bubbly moments, so hey, she at least didn't translate most of her dullness onto the show. But man, that U-turn really impacted their race, as they couldn't be able to catch up in the following leg that would end with their elimination. And I'll say, I was actually surprised that they went home, because for some reason, I thought they made it farther than they did, but you know what? It is what it is. Natalie and Stephanie. Okay, definitely one of the more stronger teams on the season, and they actually did provide some inter-team conflict with their times at bickering at each other, which, hey, at least is riveting. And their downfall episode, though, I'll say, kind of felt anticipated after a bit of their struggles leading up to it, did feel very notable. Then we got Tucker and Eric, and they were just your typical male dominating team, which they did have some really strong performance throughout the run, but I think their downfall was pretty glorious to watch, especially with all that hubris they have completely shattering. Though with that, I will say, once they were eliminated, it did ease up the competition for Jag and Jazz, which I do feel like with the lack of Tucker and Eric being the only true challenger towards them, it essentially had the season lost its steam with such a clear frontrunner by the end of it. So Tucker and Eric do have a major impact on the season and its pacing as well. Jack and Chelsea, who I thought had at least something to bring to the table with their constant bantering, especially a parent-child duo. And yeah, I'm pretty surprised they made it this long, as I thought they were going to be eliminated around the middle stretch of the season, but for them to have reached the final 5 was definitely something that I was not really anticipated based on their performance. But hey, you know, kudos to them, and at least they did have some riveting moments because of their constant back and forth. And then we have Izzy and Paige, who was another exciting figure coming into the season, as she was such a dramatic personality on BB25, despite the show just stupidly purpling her. But for her to be on The Amazing Race, she was pretty decent, though I'm still mad that the edit still decided to make her a bit shallow in certain ways. But hey, she at least did add some humor, and I especially liked her dynamic with Paige too, so whatever Izzy can bring to the table, it will be as memorable as it could have been. And then to the finalists, starting with Joseph Adam, and like I mentioned before, with Adam's situation, I really do sympathize with him, and I really like how he was able to overcome that throughout his run. And I'll say, out of all the partners on the season, I think Adam's the most compelling non-Big Brother contestant, just stemming from his very sympathetic background, but also how much of his dynamic with his brother is very compelling too. And I like how Joseph is able to keep his brother mediated throughout the race. And while yes, he did have that catastrophic leg that barely saved them thanks to the non-elimination, it still felt like it filled a lot more to their story of being able to maneuver around their errors. Then for the second place runner-up, Kyla and Taylor, who are the only team coming into this race as both former Big Brother players, and yeah, they at least had their moments throughout the season. And likewise, Taylor once again is always someone you can count on to make it to the end and avoid any sort of elimination, which is an impressive feat on her end. But I should also talk about Kylan too, since he was a very interesting player back on his season, and while it does suck for him that he's still not able to pull out a win, this is at least the closest he's gotten, and his dynamic with Taylor was somewhat unique to watch. And as racers, they were fine. I mean, they weren't doing well in the first few legs, but they did eventually catch up more, and although they did have close calls in like leg 9 and 10, they still were able to find their footing again and maintain their position to be a part of the top 2 teams. And then now to talk about the winners, Jazz and Jag. Which, taking back to what I mentioned about Tucker and Eric, once they left, it was pretty foreshown that Jazz and Jag were just going to win this, as no one else was really a true competitor compared to them. Like, they do have one of the more higher averages coming out of this season, which is just insane. But them constantly winning legs was also what made me feel really checked out of this season, because there was really nothing else going for it. And also the fact that they're not the most dynamic personalities in the world, so it just lessened all of that appeal to make them rootable. Nothing against them as human beings, but their domination on the race just reduced a lot of the reaction with this season. They are still very dominant racers, but for me, I think having them on this one appearance is good enough. So yeah, that wraps up everything about Amazing Race 38, aka the European Adventure. And like I said, the season was just not the most compelling in the world. Definitely stems from how foreseeable it was for Jazz and Jag to ultimately steamroll the race and win it, and they do. And despite this all Big Brother player theme, I just feel like this season is pretty unnotable, considering there's not really a big standout moment from this season. Like, for me, I just did not have much investment into the season, where there are points where I forgot certain things even happened. So yeah, overall, a pretty middling season of the show. Not entirely bad, but also not very remarkable too. So that's everything I gotta say, and likewise, I'll be continuing to cover reality TV content on this channel, with Survivor 49 just ending right around the corner, and the official preview for Survivor 50 will be coming out soon as well, so I'll be making coverage on them too. But with all of that, I appreciate you guys tuning in.